Good show.
Who cares what I think? Moonjumper here. Welcome to this special edition, episode 7 of Who Cares What I Think. Once again, interrupting my planned programming schedule, which I might as well throw out the window because I got to talk about this first. Folks, it has happened. For the first time in 47 years, an animated series with the word Star Trek in the title has premiered on television. Star Trek Lower Decks. Well, sort of on television, at least on television in Canada. In the US, it's on CBS All Access, which I watched on my big HD television via Roku. Some younger folks out there may be content to watch it on their cell phones, happily pay an extra $30 to Disney Plus to watch Mulan on their 3 or 4 inch cell phone screen. Sorry, no, it's just not the same. If you're going to pay for a streaming service, for crying out loud, at least watch it on an actual television screen. Get you an actual streaming device. Roku, Amazon Fire, Apple TV, it doesn't matter. They all do the same thing, and they're not expensive. A Roku Express is like, what, $20 or something. Don't watch Star Trek or Mulan on your cell phone. Get yourself a streaming device, hook it up to your TV, get the full experience. You will thank me, especially for the Lower Decks, because it is chocked full of Easter eggs you will not see on your 3-inch screen. And you will thank me if you like, share, subscribe, hit that notification bell, because before it is all over, despite the title of my show, you will care what I, Moonjumper, thinks. Or not, I don't know, I can't read your mind. So, Lower Decks, the first 5 episodes have dropped on CBS All Access, halftime. And by the time you hear this, I'm sure more episodes will have dropped. My schedule just doesn't allow me to get this out any faster, take it or leave it, who cares what I think. But as a lifelong certified Texas Trekkie whose very first exposure to any iteration of Star Trek when I was a little boy in the 1970s actually was Star Trek the Animated Series on Saturday morning on NBC, not CBS, but NBC. What did I, your friendly neighborhood Moonjumper, think of the first half of Season 1 of Star Trek Lower Decks? By the way, some minor spoilers, you may want to go watch it first, and I do recommend watching it, I'll say that much. Watch it, form your own opinion, and then come back and we'll compare notes. And we don't have to agree, who cares what I think, but we can still be friends. What a concept. Freedom of thought, freedom of taste, something that seems to boggle the minds of a whole lot of people in the cancel culture year of 2020. But what about the far-off year of 2380? That is the year CBS says that Lower Decks takes place. So before I render my verdict on whether or not the first 5 episodes of Lower Decks sucked, let me throw up this timeline graphic that I made just to remind us where we're at on the so-called prime timeline, because that is relevant to my review. Remember, according to CBS, officially, this is the original timeline of the original series and all of the Trek television series produced so far to date, as well as the original series movies back in the 80s and the TNG movies in the 90s and early 2000s. Remember, the prime timeline does not include any of the JJ films, the so-called Kelvin timeline, which is a completely different timeline, with one exception, that being the destruction of Romulus in 2387, which did occur in the original timeline, but it was that event, a supernova, which opened a rift or portal and caused the split in the timelines. But the original timeline of the original series officially still exists. You can argue about secret licensing deals all you want, you can headcanon it all you want. I've got my own theories, which I'll discuss in a future video, but officially, until CBS tells us otherwise, this is the timeline. So let's just recap. We start back in the 22nd century, that's the 2150s, about 130 years from now, with Enterprise, the crew of the NX-01, Scott Bakula before he moved to New Orleans. Then we move forward another 100 years, about 230 plus years from now, to the 23rd century, or the 2250s, where we have The Cage and the apocryphal Star Trek Discovery. I'm kidding. Discovery is canon. It's completely anachronistic, a continuity disaster, but it's painful to say it, but it is canon nonetheless. 10 years later, we can breathe a little bit of relief here because now it's the 2260s, it's TOS, yes, Star Trek, the original series, Kirk, Spock, and the gang, and the animated series. Yes, the further animated adventures of Kirk and Spock are also canon, and so are the movies that followed with the original series cast, set mostly in the 2280s. Jump ahead another 70 to 80 years, it's now the 24th century, or the TNG era, where you can say, a majority of Star Trek actually takes place, beginning with Star Trek The Next Generation in the 2360s, that's 100 years after TOS, and immediately followed by Deep Space Nine and Voyager in the 2370s, as well as the TNG movies ending with Nemesis in the year 2379 AD. Lower Decks takes place exactly 1 year after Nemesis in the year 2380, or you could say 2 years after the end of Voyager. And that's where we're at. You could call Lower Decks sort of the final coda of the classic TNG era, which is still 7 years before Romulus is destroyed in 2387, and 19 years, almost 2 decades, before Star Trek Picard in 2399, the eve of the 25th century. So think of Lower Decks as set at the end of that classic 24th century TNG era. Still quite a bit of time, almost a generation, before the apocalyptic years of Old Man Picard. And the reason I bring all of this up is directly related to my opinion of Lower Decks. Does Lower Decks fit into the canon? No, sorry, scratch that. I should say continuity. Does Lower Decks fit into classic continuity as we know it? In other words, it's not a question of whether or not it is canon. Canon and continuity are not synonymous. They are not the same thing. It's a question of whether or not Lower Decks fits smoothly into the continuity of the established timeline. I'm looking at you, Discovery. Discovery breaks continuity. It destroys continuity. But beyond all logic, it is canon. There is an important distinction there. So does Lower Decks, as of the first 5 episodes, the first half of season 1, fit smoothly into the established continuity? And so far, they can screw it up down the road, but so far, I gotta say the answer is yes. Mike McMahan, Lower Decks creator and showrunner, has done a fantastic job of creating a late TNG era appropriate look for Lower Decks. Now, some people think that doesn't matter. Some people think that Klingorks are just fine. I happen to think it is important. And for that reason alone, I'm willing to give Lower Decks some kudos and say, no, it did not suck. Now, that being said, it's a bit of a mixed bag. As pilots go, Episode 1, Second Contact, is pretty average. It's not terrible, it's not great. Trek pilots tend to be kind of on the average side. The best pilots in the franchise were actually in the original series, and there were basically 3 of them. The Cage, Where No Man Has Gone Before, and arguably, The Man Trap, which was technically not a pilot, but it was the first episode to air, so for the general public, it basically acted as a pilot. All 3 of those episodes were very strong episodes to introduce us to the world of Star Trek. And another pilot episode no one ever mentions, but I think is one of the best pilots of the franchise, is Beyond the Farthest Star, the first episode of Star Trek the Animated Series from Filmation in 1973. It had some serious high-concept science fiction going on in that little episode. Whereas your TNG era pilots were kind of just, well, okay. I mean, Encounter at Farpoint probably being the weakest, but even it was, okay. Enterprise had a decent enough pilot. That's kind of my feeling on Second Contact, the Lower Decks pilot. It's okay. It's not bad. I do think it's a little heavy on the gross-out humor, which we actually don't have in the following episode. But the fact that it's in the first episode, I think that could repel some people, which is a shame. But it serves its intended purpose of introducing the characters, the basic premise and tone, which we know always evolves over time, and as I said, reintroduces a Star Trek that we actually recognize from a visual and technological standpoint, and I appreciate that. I've said it before, I'll say it again. Disney Star Wars, love it or hate it, the Millennium Falcon still looks like the Millennium Falcon. X-Wings still look like X-Wings. And the USS Cerritos looks like a starship that could actually pull alongside the Enterprise D and not look out of place. And in the age of Kurtzman Trek, that is refreshing. The uniforms, the tech, the phasers, the LCARs, the starship interiors, the shuttlecraft, all era appropriate. I didn't see any 150-year-old Discovery shuttles flying around like we see in Picard. These are TNG era appropriate shuttles. Now, actually, to be fair, the Discovery shuttles flying around in Picard look perfectly at home in 2399. The problem is they don't belong in the Discovery era, but that's a whole nother video. Speaking of Discovery, in Lower Decks Episode 2, Envoys, we have real Klingons instead of reptilian Klingorks, and an almost countless number of deep-cut references and Easter eggs, including a shape-shifting Vandorian posing as an Andorian, as well as an Auralian. Both are aliens introduced in the original animated series in the 1970s and not seen since. And one of the main characters of Lower Decks, Chief Medical Officer Dr. Tiana, is a Cation, the same species as Lieutenant Maris, again from Star Trek the Animated Series. And why not? 2D animation is an easy, inexpensive way to bring back some of the really complex looking aliens and environments we used to see in the old animated series, which would be cost prohibitive in live action even with CGI, even to this day. So I fully expect to see a whole lot more references to the old animated series. Watch for them. Both episodes are full of just subtle, not in your face like you'd get in Discovery, but subtle Easter eggs scattered throughout the background. We see a TOS Klingon disruptor on display in Envoys, which we haven't seen in quite a while. Well, not since the original series and I guess the animated series. In Captain Freeman's ready room, we see a number of knickknacks decorating her shelves. Now there's a well-worn California state flag, which relates to the Cerritos being a California-class starship, and Cerritos is the name of a city in California. All the shuttles are named for national parks in California, so there's some thought put into that. But more to the point, there's a number of items on Freeman's shelf which refer to various past episodes, but the two that jumped out at me as an old school TOS fanatic is a Starfleet military cap identical to Captain Pike seen displayed in the cage from 1964, as well as what appears to be a Roman-style short sword similar to those seen in the TOS episode Bread and Circuses. This may imply that the Federation still maintains some kind of relationship with the Roman-like inhabitants of System 892. There's at least one novel, non-canon of course, which claims that by the 24th century they're already part of the Federation. I don't know if I buy that, but I certainly see them staying in touch, and it's cool to see that little reference. The pilot episode also gives us a return of the Argo, the Jeep-like rover from Nemesis. That was a fun callback. And let me say something about the Argo. Nemesis, in my opinion, was a pretty dumb movie. It's kind of a toss-up which is worse, Nemesis or Star Trek V. It was that bad. In fact, I actually like Star Trek V better. But the Argo from Nemesis is not one of the things I complain about from that movie. The idea that you cannot have a wheeled vehicle in Star Trek is kind of silly. How is it that 24th century humans traversing miles of alien terrain on foot is somehow a mark of great advancement? Obviously, having some kind of ground vehicle available to you is not an insane idea, and it's also not unprecedented. We've seen Starfleet utilize a wheeled ground vehicle before in Star Trek's previous animated series. In a 1974 episode whose title I probably cannot say on YouTube, because it's 2020, free speech, so just look it up, but here's the vehicle. Now, to be clear, this was not a Starfleet vehicle. It was provided to them by a feline race called the Vidala, which, interestingly enough, is described as the oldest surviving spacefaring race known to the Federation at that time. So, this is a highly advanced species who had warp drive long before the Vulcans, long before the Andorians, Tellarites, or any Federation species up to that point. And yet the Vidala were using a wheeled all-terrain vehicle, possibly amphibious, which makes sense. It makes sense to have options when traversing miles of dangerous alien terrains.
We are orbiting the planet Argo.
The animated series also introduced Starfleet's Aqua-shuttle.
Will soon be undergoing similar transformation.
I suggest that we get these seawater and algae specimens.
Submerge, Lieutenant.
Which allowed the Enterprise crew to explore and study the oceans of planets they visited.
Dual respiratory system, lungs and gills.
And a Starfleet boat called the Scouter Gig. And don't forget the Delta Flyer was also shown to be amphibious. Exploring an alien planet solely on foot is not a sign of advancement, so I am perfectly cool with the Argo, and it was great seeing it in lower decks. Mike McMahan knows Star Trek, and I appreciate that. One senses that Alex Kurtzman, who I swear is yet to watch an episode of Star Trek, even though he's been running the franchise for years now, may be sitting in his office signing the checks, but for the moment, he's staying out of Mike McMahon's way and letting McMahan take the driver's seat, and, well, I appreciate that too. And that brings me to episode 3. And stop the tape. I'm going to call that the end of part 1. I've still got another 20 plus minutes left on my original recording. I've always got a lot to say when it comes to Star Trek. Part 2 will pick up on episode 3, Temporal Edict, which is an episode I absolutely loved and proves that Lower Deck showrunner Mike McMahan is his own man. He is not Alex Kurtzman, and Lower Decks is not Star Trek Discovery. And I highly recommend that you keep an open mind and give this show a shot. That said, like all good Trekkies, I've got some nitpicks, some questions, and there is one thing in Lower Decks that has really bothered me a lot, and I will address that coming up in part 2. In the meantime, who cares what I think? From deep in the heart of Texas, I am Moonjumper. Be sure to like, share, subscribe, hit that notification bell so you'll know when part 2 drops, and please let me know what you think down in the comments below, because I do care what you think. See you in part 2.